Okay, so today we're going to talk about leading in times of disaster. This is for Module 1 Critical Thinking Assignment Option 2. So a little background on the disaster I chose to focus on. I'm going to focus on the Iowa derecho. So it occurred August 10th, 2020. It impacted Nebraska through Indiana, with Iowa being the hardest hit area. Wind speeds from 110 to 140 miles per hour, which is the equivalent of a Category 3 to 4 hurricane based upon the damages it did. And then it left residents without power, basic necessities, shelter, all of those kinds of things. All of that information is from Bennett 2020. So the disaster response. So this is really where the key decision making and critical thinking should have come into play. So we saw a huge community response. We saw Facebook groups get organized that have now raised $115,000 and are still helping residents because they're still being impacted. We saw disaster relief organizations, people like the Red Cross, United Way, those kinds of things. The Red Cross had a shelter established by August 10th in the evening. However, they had very, very limited staffing on the shelter. That's from RAM 2020. We did see a response from the National Guard. However, they were not dispatched until August 14th. So 4 days after the disaster had hit. That's from RAM 2020. And then a government response. So our governor did not ask Trump for a federal emergency declaration for our area until August 16th. So 6 days after the derecho had occurred. That's from RAM 2020. So there were some complications with those responses. There was a huge lack of communication. There was a lack of preparedness, and both of those are from RAM 2020. And then really what fueled this lack of preparedness, lack of communication, was a lack of understanding of pre-disaster dynamics. That's from Shillingford, Williams, and Allen 2020. So if you expect to be able to be successful in reacting to a disaster, you have to understand the dynamics and how things will work pre-disaster. So you need to figure things out, practice things, have plans in place. So decisions to be made. So they needed to identify your critical needs, who is impacted, organizations that can help those that were impacted, where we can help those impacted, where we have buildings that are structurally sound that we could implement help, and then finally how to communicate with those that were impacted, and then how to communicate within organizations so they can help effectively. So a big example of this is going to be medical supplies. So how do you distribute, how do you ensure that they are kept at the temperatures they're required to be to maintain effectiveness? How do you ensure that the people that need them get them? So the key to surviving and preventing pandemics after a disaster is medical supply distribution. That's from She and He 2018. So you need to establish a new distribution channel based upon time and cost. Again, She and He 2018. So really what officials and what leaders need to do is they need to ensure medical supplies are, number one, kept in the proper conditions. So let's make sure we have a place to keep them while we're deciding what the distribution channels can be. Then we need to be able to reach and benefit those in need. So distribution channels aren't effective if you're not reaching those that actually need the medications. So there are a ton of factors at play here, but really it boils down to time and cost, and it boils down to reacting and not necessarily following your pre-established distribution channels. All of that is from She and He 2018. So decision-making types. So there are two main types of decision-making we're going to focus on here. So prescriptive decision-making is the method of making the best decision possible. It uses a lot of analytics and data. So that's from Bazerman and Moore 2013. Descriptive decision-making is going to be focusing on how those decisions are made. So again, Bazerman and Moore 2013. So which one are we going to recommend in this situation? I'm going to go for prescriptive decision-making because honestly, in a time of disaster, you have to make the best possible decision with the information you have at the time. So why did I pick prescriptive decision making? So making the best decision possible is extremely important in an emergency situation. So if someone is to make a decision that's not the best possible, it can impact not only those that have already been impacted by disaster, but it can hinder their relief efforts, it can hinder their recovery efforts, all of those kinds of things. So additionally, leaders should consider potential unintended consequences or black swan scenarios that may result from decisions they make. That's from Meckler and Bull 2020. So when a leader is making a decision, it's important that you think through all of the potential consequences. consequences. All those black swan scenarios that are scenarios that you're like, that's never going to happen, there's a super rare chance, you still need to think through it. You still need to think about those things and make a plan for if that were to occur, what we would do in that case. So then also leaders should generate scenarios prior to the emergency situations and consider the best way to respond to scenarios in those circumstances, outlining both the likely and unlikely scenarios. Again, Meckler and Bull 2020. So part of the reason that there were so many problems with the derecho response was because officials had never thought about a emergency response where they couldn't communicate because there was no phone and internet. And so that slowed disaster efforts so much that people were without homes, without water, without food, without medical supplies, and emergency services had no way to communicate with each other to make a disaster relief plan at that point. So the critical thinking skills that you're going to need in order to respond to this. So the importance of critical thinking skills. Number one, critical thinking skills are key to responding to natural disasters because they are constantly changing scenarios. That's from Albanese and Petouras 2018. So leaders have to be able to think critically to make the best possible decisions with the information they have available. They're not going to have all of it, but you have to make a decision based upon what you know at the time. Again, Albanese and Petouras 2018. So leaders should be able to identify a problem, recognize assumptions, discuss possible solutions, and then use inductive and deductive reasoning to draw conclusions. Again, all of that is Albanese and Petouras 2018. So critical thinking is extremely important regardless of the disaster. In the case of the Iowa derecho, there were definitely situations that could have been improved with more prior critical thinking, prior planning, and then better scenario preparedness. So hopefully this was really helpful. Here are my references, page 1 and 2, and thank you so much for listening.